Hey, it's Jonathan here from Mindful Communication, and in this video, we're going to continue this conversation all around setting boundaries. Now, if you haven't watched the last two videos, I highly recommend checking those out first. The videos on how to start the boundary setting conversation and how to actually set the boundary with another person. Now, once you move through those two parts, then you come up to what is probably the toughest conversation, and that's actually enforcing the boundary. Now, this other person, although they agreed to this rule, to this boundary that you may have set, they may have violated it. They may have crossed a line, and that just doesn't work. And this is where a lot of us falter. We don't want to have this conversation. It's really difficult and it's really challenging. And it can be incredibly uncomfortable as well. Nonetheless, it is an important part of setting a boundary. And that's why in this video, I'm going to cover how to have this conversation and make sure that you have the right tools and mindset in order to approach this conversation powerfully and effectively. All right, so let's dive into this, how to enforce this boundary. So you started the boundary conversation, you set the boundary, everyone agreed to everything, you go off and they break the rules. So basically now you're in a tough situation. We agreed to some rules at the beginning and now they've been broken. So what do you do? And here I'm gonna walk you through 6 step-by-step points that you wanna consider as you're having this enforcing the rules, enforcing the boundaries kind of conversation. Step number 1, you want to outline the consequences. You actually want to do this in the previous conversation, but this is still an important part to remember. You want to make sure that the consequences are really clear to the other person. And now this could be any kind of consequence under the sun. The key is that you want to make sure that they agree to that consequence, that they understand that consequence. This way, there's no surprises when you're actually coming back to have this conversation that the consequences are there. Tip number 2, use enforceable consequences. This one is also something that we often look over, and we want to make sure that whatever consequence we set up, we have the ability and also the willingness to enforce that consequence. You've maybe experienced before when someone gives you a consequence and you kind of know it's an empty consequence. They're not really going to enforce it. And what that ultimately does is that they lose power in that situation, and the other person, maybe yourself in this case, is a lot less likely to respect the rules and the boundaries. This is a very common thing that happens with parents and their kids. You can imagine a situation like this. Jonathan, if you don't come right now for dinner, I'm never cooking you dinner again. If you don't vacuum that room, you're gonna be grounded for a whole month. You get the picture. And unfortunately, threats like this don't actually impact us. We receive these warnings, we receive these kind of empty threats, and we're reluctant to act on them because we know deep down that there's going to be no real severe consequence. Maybe we'll do a little bit of what it is that they asked, maybe we'll feel a little bit motivated, but in the long run, this is not a sustainable way to actually get someone to do something because ultimately we know deep down that that consequence is hollow. And so that's why we always make sure that whatever consequence we want to outline for the other person is something that we're actually willing to do. Tip number 3, check for understanding. So this is a really important communication technique and step that most people miss. This is super useful when you're delivering any kind of instruction, any kind of very specific information to another person. What you want to do is you want to ask the other person to summarize what it is that they heard you say. And that's because it gives you an opportunity to check that they actually got your message. And you're going to ask them to repeat back 2 different things. The first thing they're going to repeat back is the request. You're going to make sure that they're clear on what the boundary is, what the rule is, what the expectation exactly is, so that you can make sure you're on the same page in regards to that. The other thing you're going to ask them to repeat back is the consequence. You're going to make sure that they actually understand what the consequence is of breaking this rule, of breaking this agreed upon boundary. By taking this step, you're going to significantly increase the chances that they are going to actually really respect this rule, this expectation, this boundary. And if it is broken, you're going to have a much easier time enforcing the consequences of breaking that rule. Tip number 4, speak in observable facts. Okay, so you've had the conversation, you made sure they're clear on it, and they broke the rule. And so now you have to have this uncomfortable conversation where you outline the fact that 1, there was a rule, And 2, it was broken. And one important thing that we want to make sure to do in this specific conversation is we want to speak as much as possible in observable facts. What I mean by that is we want to make sure that we're speaking from a place where we're really grounded in what actually happened. There are no stories, there are no interpretations, there's no room for any of that. It's just straight up, this is what happened. And a great way that I love to know that I'm speaking in observable facts is I like to think of the situation where we have a video camera actually watching what happened. And we describe what we see and maybe even what we hear on the camera. So an example of this might sound like, we agreed that we wouldn't speak between the hours of 9 and 11 a.m. That would be dedicated work time. And what you did is you came up to me and you spoke to me between that time. And that violates our agreement. By stating observable facts instead of our stories, our interpretations, our perceptions, assessments, evaluations of the situation, we're getting grounded in what actually happened. And if we're only talking about the facts, there's very little room for pushback, for arguing, and we can actually have a much more productive and efficient conversation. Okay, so we've said that they broke the agreement, and now for these next 2 tips, you can actually head in one of 2 directions. The first direction we can head in is tip number 5. Collaborate. And what I mean by collaborate is that you can actually partner with them to find a solution that is going to work, because clearly what you have set up doesn't work. This is an option that you can take if you're still a little bit reluctant to actually enforce the full consequences that you outlined. What you can do is you can have a conversation around the fact that you agree to the rule, it was broken, and you just don't know what to do about it. So an example of this in conversation might look like, so we agreed to this rule that we wouldn't speak between the hours of 9 and 11 a.m. and that agreement was not respected. So, how are we going to move forward in a way that will have you respect this boundary that's really important to me? See, what I did there is I'm actually asking them once again for their partnership in this. And this is creating what's called buy-in. We're having them bought in to creating an idea with us, ensuring that we're going to move toward a resolution that's peaceful and that works for everybody. Tip number 6, be your word. So maybe you headed down the collaborate route, you asked them for their partnership, you came up with another more realistic boundary, and yet still it was broken. Now we come to this really difficult conversation where we actually have to enforce the consequence. And the only tip I really have for you around this is to just be your word. Listen, I get it. This is a really difficult conversation to have, but the fact is that you've taken so many measures, so many steps to get to this point. You've really checked in with them. You've made sure they understood, you had them agree, and they still broke the rules. And so it's time for you to step up and to actually enforce the consequence that you outlined that you would do. And so what that might look like in a conversation is, listen, we initially agreed that between the hours of 9 and 11, we would not speak to each other, and you broke that agreement. Then we came back and we made a new rule that it would be between 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m., and now you've broken that rule again. Unfortunately, I have to lay down these consequences that I told you I would lay down. So once again, in this example, I'm being very factual. I'm only using the facts of what actually happened. There's no stories, no interpretations. This is what happened, and now we have consequences. I really encourage you to be your word in the matter. And that's because although it may not be registering consciously, at a subconscious level, we're learning that we can get away with breaking rules. And that's the same thing as this example I used earlier with the parents. Once we notice that our parents are not being their word, that they will use these empty threats, we're less and less likely to actually take their consequences and threats seriously at all. So I give you permission to be a person of integrity. And if you've taken all the steps and they still break the rules, then you have permission to enforce those consequences. So let's do a quick recap of all the different things we went over in this video. First, what you're gonna do is you're gonna outline the consequences. Then you're gonna make sure that the consequences are enforceable. Ask yourself, am I actually willing to do this? Then you're gonna have them repeat back what it is that they heard you say. And you're going to ask to make sure they repeat back not just the request that you actually made, but also make sure that they're clear on the consequences that are going to follow when that request is not fulfilled on. Then you're going to step into the next conversation. If they break that rule, if they break that boundary, you're going to make sure to speak only in observable facts. No room for stories, no room for interpretations. Just the what so, what happened in the situation. Remember the analogy of the video camera watching the situation. Then you're going to be faced with two different routes you can head down. One is to collaborate with them. Now that they've broken the rule, you can ask them again for their buy-in to come up with another rule that's really going to work this time. And you can repeat that process as many times as you feel comfortable. And then lastly, you're going to actually be your word. You're going to enforce the boundary, you're going to enforce that consequence, and you're going to explain to them why in observable facts. So that's it. That's how you set boundaries successfully from start to finish. Now, this conversation may be really difficult, but I promise you that when you learn to respect yourself in these situations, you're going to invite way more peace and way more ease into your life. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give it a great big thumbs up. You can also find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. I have lots of great communication tips and tricks on there as well. And be sure to check out the Mindful Communication podcast, where I interview thinkers, influencers, and experts all around the art and science of connection. Check it out. And lastly, what I do is I work with established entrepreneurs to have them live a life as successful as their business. If that's something that you're interested in learning more about, make sure to get in touch with me on my website, mindfulcommunication.me. You'll find the link in the description below. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.